everyone, and welcome. Let's get you squared away here. All right. I'm Dawn Bjork, and I want to welcome you to the continuation of our Top Essential Functions webinar for K-Squared Technologies. This is a continuation of our part one that we looked at last month. So let's go ahead and dive in. Thanks so much for being here. Thanks so much for joining us. Last month included some function basics. We looked at understanding cell references, and I shared with you how to create range names so you can more effectively use functions. And then we got a start at our data analysis functions. So you'll find that webinar, if you were not able to attend that, you'll find that on our K-Squared Technologies YouTube channel. So we're going to move from those foundational pieces to now explore more data analysis functions, including VLOOKUP, XLOOKUP, and some others that I think will be very insightful and helpful for you. I will share with you some useful date functions, text functions, and some other tricks with text. So that's our plan for our time together. We're going to dive right in, and our first data analysis function for today is VLOOKUP. So let's talk about what VLOOKUP is all about. With VLOOKUP, it's equal VLOOKUP, and it has 4 parts to it. And one moment here, I'll go ahead here and just so you can focus on the screen, I'll go ahead and drop my video. So for VLOOKUP, think of this as a vertical lookup. There are other lookup functions that you may have run across or worked with. But VLOOKUP is designed so that it can help you to find data within a specific list. So you might have a master list of clients. You might have a master list of products or different categories, accounting codes, things like that. And so you can think of it as a vertical lookup. There's HLOOKUP and others, but this is the most common of those. The whole idea is that we have a lookup values. That's the first argument in this function. So the lookup value is something that you want to match. So that means you might have maybe a download or a worksheet where you want to populate other columns coming from this master list. Now that master list could be in the same workbook. It might instead be in a completely different workbook. It might be, as long as it's something that you have access to and anybody else who uses it has access to. So the whole idea with the VLOOKUP is you are telling it, first of all, what is it I want to look up? The second is, where am I looking? And this is where range names are helpful, because instead of having a literal cell range, for instance, like, A4 through K1023, something like that, you can give that a range name and it makes it much easier for you as you're working with it. When Excel takes that value to that location, that range of cells or range name, then the third argument is the column number that has the results in the lookup table. So that's the idea there. That is that it is what number. So the first thing to know is that in that range it's looking, the first column has to be the column that has that potential lookup value. It might not be column A. That's why it could be a range of cells, but it's the first column. So the idea as it's moving down and let's say it finds a match, then how many columns does it have to go over to find the corresponding data that you want to bring into your worksheet? So we are counting not column A, B, C, D, etc. We're counting from the column where it has the potential match. 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. That's what you put in. And then the fourth argument is a question that's basically asking, is it a range lookup? And the answer is either going to be true or false, not yes, no, or T or F or anything like that. It's a little bit flipped in that most of the time we want it to be an exact match. Usually we're matching to something that's not falls within a range, but we want it to be exact. So think of something like a social security number, a product code, something that, you know, we don't want something that comes close. We want to find only exactly that. So most of the time, the answer we put in here is false. And this is a really important one because technically it's optional. But if you don't put in an answer, then what will happen is Excel will put in true. It just defaults to that. So this becomes an important part to correctly and effectively work with that. So there's just something to keep in mind to make sure that you're going to have success as you create this VLOOKUP. So let's look at an example of what that might look like. So what we're going to be building is basically, we want to bring in, based upon the employee ID, the division, last name, and supervisor. Now, for our example, this the original data source or the master list will be in the same workbook. But as I mentioned, it doesn't have to be. And so we're going to take the employee ID, which in the example we look at will be in A4 in the original worksheet. That's what you see at the top. It will look in a range name called employees. That's the second part of the argument. Once it finds a match, then how many columns over will it go? Well, if we were looking for the division, that is 6 columns. So we'll put in 6 for that, so it will bring in whatever is found in that 6th column. And then the last part of the argument is that we say false. We want it to be an exact match. So it's important to keep in mind too, that if there are any duplicates, it's going to find the first one. And so it's good to have really clean, normalized data for that master list. So that's the basic structure of VLOOKUP, and we're going to look at this hands-on. So in this example, let me go ahead and get myself to the correct location. And one moment here. All right, we're just dealing with a few technical glitches this morning, so we're all squared away now, I believe. We hope so. This is then the example that we're going to work with. Let's go ahead and look at what the master list is. Okay, so that is a worksheet. I'm simply moving here to my corner. I right click and I want to go to ABC employees. Okay, so ABC employees right now is just a range of data. I'm going to create a quick range name for it. So this is a kind of review of what we saw last month. I'll start here in cell A2. I don't need to include those headings. And I'll hold down Shift and press Control and the End key, as in the end. So when I do that, I'm highlighting from that point to the bottom right-hand corner. So in this case, I want to highlight that entire range. Next, I'll move up to my name box, which is in the upper right-hand corner. This is one of multiple ways for us to be able to create range names. And for this, I'll type in employees. So this wasn't in there, and although I wouldn't have to, it's a lot easier than having to put in the A2 through G115, that type of thing, especially because this range might grow. So there we go. And with that then, let's go ahead and I'll move back to, and I'll look at the original one, or where I want to pull this in. And For this is where I'll build my VLOOKUP. So we could start typing it out, but if you're not familiar with it yet, one of the things I mentioned in our last session was about using something called insert function. And insert function is available in a couple ways. It's through to the left here of our formula bar, or we could find it in our formulas. We could find it in our formulas ribbon tab. And so here I could also choose insert functions. So this is helpful. You need to know where you're heading. That is, it's not going to answer or tell you which function to use, but it can help you to build a function that maybe that you're not that familiar with, or it's even a way to kind of help you understand a function someone else created. So we're not going to do a search. That is, that this implies that it will, really help you find the answer, which frankly, it often does not. Now, in this case, here's my recently used. Now, if it doesn't show up in this list, all I need to do is go to this drop down, and I could go to all, or I could go to lookup and reference for VLOOKUP. And in this case, not surprising, we would look down towards the bottom of the list, and here is VLOOKUP. So I'm simply going to either click on that and OK, or double click. This is the insert function. It walks through the arguments so that you can see here in bold, this is what is required. Anything that's not bold is optional, but as I shared before, that we're going to make that mandatory. So the lookup value for this, we're building the formula as we select these or enter them in. The lookup value is A4. That's what I want it to look up. It's always good to double check here, because as you start making selections, you will see the answers or potential errors if Excel is not finding what you're specifying. So here I can just type in the name of the range name for where it should look. And this is the advantage of having range names. I might, if it's in another workbook, I might have to then instead move to it and select it, because it needs to have the path where that would be, somewhere on our network or SharePoint, for instance. So this is the second part. Where is it supposed to look? And then for this one, where do I want it to bring in that data? Then in that case, then this is going to be column 6 for division. So what we're seeing so far is it's giving us, this is the answer based upon what you provided so far. And then for the range lookup part, when you click on it, notice in each case, Excel is trying to give you an explanation, but sometimes there's terminology that can be a little bit complicated with this. So notice, to find an exact match, what we're going to do is put in false. And for some of you, that's all you're ever going to want is an exact match. I'll show you an example where it's an approximate, but it's really, not typical that we would have those types of situations. So in this case, then, now I'm ready to say okay. And I could copy this down. And now I have it populating the division for each one of those. So that's something then that I could then build for last name, supervisor, and any other columns I might want to populate. So there's a little bit of a trick here too, because it can be very common that you may want to be populating multiple columns, and you don't necessarily have to build that VLOOKUP over and over and over again. But we want to be able to leverage the work that you've already put into this. So here's the trick. I'm going to go back to this first one. I'll edit it. So I just double clicked on it. You could hit your F2 function key and you should be all squared away there. Now we're going to make this lookup value for the employee ID an absolute reference. It's technically a mixed reference because I'm going to have it absolutely go to column A, but not just to row 4. So I'm not going to put a $sign in front of the 4 because I want that to be relative. I want that to be something I can copy down. By making this then absolute reference for column A, now what I can do, I'll copy this down. My results don't change for division, but when I copy it across, I'm going to see that they're all right now saying green. That's okay, because now I've done the hard work. I can just edit this one, and my last name is found in column 2. And the supervisor is found in column 7. So all I'm doing is editing which column. The logic is still the same in each case. I'm just telling it to bring in different data in each time. So that's the idea that we have there. I'll go ahead and make that column a bit wider. Now I can copy these down, just select them using my fill handle. I could double click for that or drag it. So now I've been able to populate with that. And if we just looked at one of these randomly, for instance, because of that mixed reference, $A, and in this case 7, it's going to sell A7, and then it's looking at employees, and it will then bring in the 7th answer for that, and it will show that it's false. So that's the idea of a V lookup, a vertical lookup. I'll show you an X lookup as well as a potential alternative to that. But that's the idea of working with that type of lookup. Okay, so that's one of the things that you can do for that. Now, we'll go back to the insert function for just a moment. Let's say you're looking at a worksheet where someone else has created a formula. It could be VLOOKUP, it might be something else, but there, it's a function typically, that you're just trying to figure out what's the logic, understand it a little better. This is also where you can go to insert function, and what will happen is Excel will present to you how everything kind of falls into place and what each one of these arguments means. And so sometimes that can give you a little bit of detective work to make that simpler for you. I mentioned we can also have an approximate VLOOKUP. That is where we it's not an exact match. It goes into a range. Not as common, but wants you to at least see the idea of what that might be. So for this example, the table is in the same worksheet. So this is more from the demonstration perspective than that it would actually typically work that way. But for this one, I already have created and I have not, so I will go ahead and do that. I'm going to create a range name here called discount. I'm not highlighting the headings because I'm only interested in, so remember with range names, now this is not the only way to create them. I'm creating here in the name box. This is not how I can edit them. So that's something to keep in mind. It doesn't matter if it's uppercase or lowercase or a mixture there. So I'm going to call this discount. Now, a couple quick things about that. I'll just mention, and you might want to refer back to our part 1 training session that we have. You can go to formulas and name manager, and this is where you can modify and edit and even create different range names. So that's another way for us to look at it. So for this one, it could be a situation where maybe you have lab results or you have other types of information where if something falls into a range, there's a certain answer. And for this one, then we would want to have every possible dollar amount that might exist related to that discount. We're simply having a range here. One of the things that's important is if you did have that, the data needs to be sorted from low to high. So, whereas if it's an exact match, it doesn't matter the order of what we're looking up. It just will find the first one that matches. So in this case, our dollar amount is 0 and it goes to the highest. Now, anything that might fall beyond that would simply land here. So let's just say, for instance, for this current purchase amount of $800, It's going to come into this discount table and look in the first column of that range. It will stop here because the next level is higher than 800. So that's how the range works. And that's why it needs to be sorted from low to high. So we'll stop at that point and then bring back that 2%. Let's look at how we build this. For this one, I'll type it out directly. So equal VLOOKUP. And you can see here as I start typing, then Excel is doing one of its automatic features, the formula autocomplete. I can simply tab or double click on that. What am I looking up? Here's that value, comma. So notice that in this arguments, as Excel is presenting this, it's showing it here in bold. That's where I currently am. So comma. Now, where am I looking? I'll start typing discount and you can see it will show up as a range name. Simply double click on that. I could type it out as well, comma. When I find a match, or if I find a match, what column should I bring back? That would be column 2, comma. And then the final part, is it an approximate match or an exact match? In this case, it's approximate. So we'll use true. Here I could type that, I'll tab, and then close parentheses. That's the idea with a VLOOKUP when it's an approximate match. And so it's bringing back that 2%. If this value changes here, let's say it's 11%. Whoops. Let's say, I think I got that. Let's say it's 1100. Then it makes it 3%. So it's stopping here. And even if it was something very specific, like, you know, if I had it be $1,395.99, what would happen here is it would then stop at this level. So that's the idea of a VLOOKUP. And this can be really helpful. The only challenge is sometimes with a VLOOKUP is some people might rearrange or have to kind of reconfigure the data that they're looking at and the data they're drawing from, because remember, it has to be what you're searching has to be the first column. So sometimes it's that you have to duplicate the column in the first one, or that it can be a little bit cumbersome. There also are other functions that we won't look at today, like index and match, when you have more complicated lookups. This is what XLOOKUP is designed to solve. XLOOKUP is a little bit different in terms of how it works. So let me just take a moment back here to this. So in this one, there's a couple different things. The VLOOKUP. First of all, our employee ID had to be the first column of whatever the specified range was. And then we were counting over. So if there was a column that, one moment, I'm going to make things work a little bit better on my system today. Okay, so the challenge is what if we delete or add a column? Well, now we're throwing off the VLOOKUP because it's saying go over to column 2 or 6 or 7 or whatever it might be. With XLOOKUP, it has a lot more flexibility because you can look left or right in working with that. So let's explore how this works. First of all, we're going to be looking at data that's very similar, but for this example, the employee ID happens to land right in the middle because it's not dependent upon moving from that position to the right. Each one of the key fields or columns that we're searching in has its own specified range name. Now, although that's not required, it makes things so much easier. So for instance, employee ID is there. That's employee ID. And it's not even including the heading. That's not important for this. We have division. We have supervisor. So hopefully you're kind of getting the idea of how that works. Okay. So with this then, an X lookup might be the solution. So X lookup, it's good to know that it's not supported by older versions of Excel. It's only going to be supported if you are working with Microsoft 365 environment. So it's also not something, if you are having to share a workbook externally, it's also not a great idea because it might not be available to someone if it has an earlier version of Excel. So that's why it's still good to know about the VLOOKUP as a solution. In this case, XLOOKUP works assuming that it is an exact match. And and we don't have as many it's a little bit more straightforward in terms of how it will behave. It can also work vertically or horizontally, so it has a lot more flexibility. Let's look at this idea. So here's what an XLOOKUP looks like. We're first of all telling it to look for the employee ID, and we already made this an absolute to column A. Then the next argument is, where am I looking for that match, which is employee ID. So range name certainly much easier than just a direct range. And then what should it bring back? Well, whatever it finds is a match in division on that same line. You know, in this case, it's because those range names are vertical, it will be a vertical lookup. But if they were horizontal, that's how it would behave as well. So this is a pretty straightforward one. Now, you can see here that there are other arguments about what happens if it's not found and some other ways that you can work with it. But in terms of the simplest approach to it, this is what we have. And so the same idea works for the department and the supervisor. We're not counting over how many, and it can work left or right because we have these range names. And this gives us a lot more flexibility if columns are added or data is moved, rather than what we have with the VLOOKUP. So consider whether or not the XLOOKUP might be a better option for you in working with it, and just something to consider. So that's another data analysis option for you that might really start getting you the solutions that will be helpful for you. Let's go ahead then and continue forward here in exploring our look at different functions in Excel. Another category that can be really useful for you is working with date functions. And there's some different possibilities here in terms of working with your date functions. So if I wanted to just put in the current date, then that is one possibility as well. So just so you know that this is it's a keyboard shortcut. If I just wanted the current date, it's not a function, it's just an entry, which is control semicolon. So it just puts in the current date, and we've got that. If I want the current time, control colon. And notice here, this is not a formula, it's not a function, it is just direct entry. But if you are logging in transactions, for instance, about when you received it, this can be a big time saver for you instead of having to type it in manually. So that might be really helpful for you. When we want to be able to have the current date or time be flexible based upon how it might change, then the two functions that will be helpful there are equal now and equal today. The difference is equal now gives you the option to show the current time. It's dependent upon whether or not you have, how you have those cells formatted. In both cases, they'll show the current date. The current time then is something that potentially could be displayed with equal now. So this is a way to be able to use it for display, but also for calculations, especially as you may be wanting to know the difference, whether it's how many hours between two time periods or how many days between two dates, those kinds of things. So that's the general idea in terms of how that works. So if we look at this then, and by the way, this won't necessarily click away and be dynamically showing the most current time. It waits until I update it. So updating could be typing in a new entry. Updating could be that I am printing or viewing, anything along those lines. That's the idea. So let's look at how this works. Here we have a formula that's kind of combining some different things. In our last session, we looked at the if function. And so the logic here is to say if the data in column B, which is date completed, if what we find in B5 is blank, so that's another function, comma, then take the current day today. Now, the nice thing about it's good to know date functions, and when we have dates in Excel, it actually has a numeric value. And that sometimes isn't as obvious. So we're looking, if we look back to the beginning of the previous century in January 1st, 1900, then it starts counting forward from there. And today's number or value is going to be one less than tomorrow's. So that's how we can do those calculations. So here's the function today. Now, this is one of the few functions where we don't have any arguments. It's just an open close parentheses minus the date received. So we're going to take the current date minus the date received. That's what happens if it's blank. Now, if it's not blank, then say done. So that's the other side of an if function. And in this case, it's shown as a character string. This is what I covered in our part 1, is a string of characters like yes, no, okay, done, needs to be shown in quotes. And one of the reasons why that's important is because Excel is looking to say, okay, is this a cell address? Is it a range name? Is it a function name? And if it doesn't recognize it as any of those, it will be an error unless you show it as a character string. So that's the logic that we have here. Say done if it has a date completed. Let's look at that. So for this, we've got some work to do, right? We have some things that haven't been completed. They're still sitting here open. But the idea with this is that if I did put in a date completed, so let's just say I have updated this now. It now says done rather than that calculation. So that's the advantage of having an if statement. We also could simply do some math with our dates. We could just simply take the date received plus 90 days. Maybe we're trying to do some projections or tracking. Or maybe we want to see how long it took us to complete various projects. And here, what is happening here is it's very similar. It's simply, once again, if date complete is blank, then say open. Otherwise, take date complete minus date received. So those aren't specific date functions, but it does show you how you can do date calculations and know that that's a possibility. Now, what we're also going to see over here, these are just a couple other ideas for you. That is, there are even more date functions, but just because they're all there doesn't mean that they may all be applicable for you. So for these, for instance, equal month, year, end of month, and date. So for the equal month, that is simply extracting the month number out of the date. That is the date to the left. Or it's extracting the month, the date year. So this can be helpful sometimes when you really want to, you're maybe sorting or searching, filtering on those kinds of things, and you don't want to get as specific with the date. And you can pull those out. You can even, copy and paste values once you get those end results. The other two are showing you the end of the month, projecting forward so many months. So you're actually putting in a number for that. So you're just picking a date. That's the first part. What's the starting date, comma, and you put in 1, 2, etc. So those are some other things that can help you as you're doing various calculations with dates. Another one that can be helpful for you would be date calculations where we're, instead of the examples that you just saw, we want to exclude weekends. That is, we don't want to, let's say, be penalized because it took a certain amount of dates to complete something, when some of those days that are being considered are weekends or might even be holidays. So how do you handle those challenges? There are two other functions that can be helpful: workday and network days. Workday and network days. So workday is a way for you to calculate the difference between two dates and or calculate forward so many dates. So a couple things that this has. What we're looking at here, here's just a regular calculation. We're just adding 30 days to that, but that doesn't really help us because we want 30 business days. So how we work with that is, first of all, workday and network days automatically exclude weekends. So they can be set to work internationally, but the way the default is that it's US or North America based, where Saturday and Sunday dates are excluded. But we can also exclude holidays. So I have in another worksheet a list of, in this case, US federal holidays, and that range, whether it's a range name or just a direct range, can also be excluded. We can have as many dates as we want to there where those are holidays within our organization. So this is something you create, not something that Excel does for you. But the structure of it, here's what the workday function looks like. It is taking the date received, adding 30 days to it, or whatever number you want, 15, 90, those kinds of things. And optionally, not only is it excluding weekends, but if you add this part to it, that is the holidays component to it, and it doesn't have to be a range called holidays or anything like that. That's just, in this case, it's just pointing to that worksheet called holidays and the range. So it's not a range name, it could be, but in this case, it's just a direct. And so it's also excluding any holidays that might fall within that time frame. So that's a nice thing. It's doing it all automatically for you, right? That's what we want these functions to help us with, is to do a lot of the time consuming work. And so that's the idea for that one. And you can see how by using this, we land in a much different place when we look at 30 business days forward rather than just 30 added to that. The network days is similar. However, it's for calculating the difference between two dates. So once again, if we were just looking at how many days did it take us to complete something, that would just be the date received versus minus the date, the date completed minus the date received. And that gives us a much different look of our data and our performance and our tracking when we're not excluding weekends and potentially holidays. With network days, this is what the formula looks like. We take the start date, comma, and the end date. And here's the logic as well over here to the right. And then that might be all we put in there. It just might be those two. But we're also excluding any holidays that might land within that range. So notice that in every case for these, we have a much different picture of what that looks like in working with it. So that might be really helpful when you have these kinds of projects, especially when it may be, it may be directly impacting how your performance is being reviewed in terms of how quickly something gets done. So definitely some consideration. Let's wrap up then and look at some text functions. These can be really handy and big time savers for you as well. A couple different things can happen. Maybe the data is coming from another source. You download the data from another system and it doesn't look the way you want it to be. So it's not in the right capitalization, for instance. Or you have multiple people touching the data, and even if you try to have best practices, it still doesn't always apply in terms of how things happen. So one of the ways to convert it, let's say in column A, this is what we have from our data, and we want it to look consistent. Well, we can use proper, upper, or lower. So you can see the idea with upper, we're just referencing that cell and making everything uppercase. Or likewise, lower would make everything lowercase. Proper is proper case, meaning capitalizing the first letter of each word. So the way it works, here I'm going to make that proper. I reference cell A2, hit enter or close for it. I'll copy that down. I can drag it or double click. And now this looks much better, right? That is, now it's in the proper case where it's capitalizing first letter of each word. If we have the results we want for that, then all we have to do here is I will highlight this. Okay. And I'm going to, so for this, I'll highlight it and then I'll copy it, Control C. And then we'll right click here and paste values. So the idea is if we have the answers we want, rather than having to keep the old data, the data that isn't working anymore, I could delete this whole column and I would still have the literal answers there. So keeping in mind that paste values is often helpful for you when we finalize or we get the answers that we want for that. So that's an idea too. Now, we also have some situations that can come up where the data is not really looking the way that we want it to. That is, maybe it needs to be combined in some ways or presented in different ways. So for that, we have concatenate or concat. So concat is the more current, that is, it is the most recent function for that. It replaces concatenate. And you can just think of it as combine. So with that, we'll choose, let's say we want to see last name, comma, first name. We've got multiple columns, but we want to combine them to get the results we want. I'll say equal, concat, and here I'll just tab. So if you ever see a function like concat is showing here with that kind of yellow exclamation mark sign on it, that means it's a deprecated function, meaning that at some point it might go away, but you can still use it. But it can be good to be in the habit here to replace it with this new one. So I want last name, so I click on last or type it in, comma. Well, if I want last name, comma, first name, I want comma and a space before I see my first name. So that goes into our character string, quote, comma, space, end quote. So that comma is different than the commas that are separating the different arguments. That is actually what I want it to add to or attach to this data. Now the comma, just say I have more to introduce another argument, and then I will choose first. So that's our concat for combining. We'll copy that down. Now we get exactly what we asked for. The only challenge here is if the data wasn't very clean because multiple people touched it or other systems. You can see here that we have some data where we have leading or trailing spaces. So for instance, for Peter Plum or Tommy Tomato, we've got leading and trailing spaces. We might also have inconsistency with capitalization. So over here, we have another example, and this is using trim. So now we have 3 functions to get this data cleaned up. So trim removes leading and trailing spaces, which is pretty cool. If any of you are thinking, oh my gosh, how many hours have I spent going in and editing and deleting those extra spaces? Trim will be your lifesaver on that and be a big value to you. So if you have data where there's just one space between, let's say, the first and second word, it will keep that. So it's not going to remove all spaces. If that was the case, we could do a find and replace and try to clean up that way. It's just removing leading and trailing spaces, or any place where there might be 2 or more spaces. It will reduce that as well. So for this function, let's look at from inside out. We did a concat to combine first name, then a space, and last name. So that's what we're asking it to do. Take the first name, add a space to it, and last name. We're also now making that proper, whatever that answer proper. So we're nesting it inside of it. And then we're nesting all of that with the trim. So basically we're going to trim the results as needed. And now we have a much cleaner end result. So hopefully that helps you when you're getting this data from different sources that isn't behaving the way that we'd really like it to be. Now for these last functions, I won't cover these in a lot of detail because I have another little trick that could be even more helpful. But sometimes we might have data where we really want to extract rather than combine. We want to pull out just different elements. So this is left, mid, and right. As an example, with left, we're just telling it how many characters from the left. And in this case, 3 characters. Mid is the middle. Where do we start? Where do we end? So if we're taking it from that code, we want it to start at 5, whatever position 5 was, and bring and show 5 characters in that case, or pulling from the right. So all pretty straightforward in terms of how those behave. That's the idea in working with that. So those are some others, but you may not even need those because I'll share with you one. We'll finish up with something that's not even a function, but definitely worth knowing. Additionally, we have where you might have comments or something where the data is found somewhere in the middle of an entry, but not necessarily so many characters over. So this is just an example for you to get a sense of how you could structure it. So for this case, we're looking, there's a commonality that is you have to have something in common. But let's say all the code started with DEN. But they're not always at the beginning or not always at the end. So it's actually using a find function. It's looking for DEN within that value. And That's what it's looking for to figure out what the starting position is for mid. That's what this whole thing is the starting position for mid. So then it knows where to start, and then 12 is how many characters to bring in. So it's an interesting end result as well. You might not need those last ones if you're familiar with flash fill. Just kind of depends upon the complexity of your data, but this is flash fill. So we'll wrap up our look at functions and look at when you don't need functions, because in this case, then we're going to instead leverage automatic, we'll say, ways to extract data. It's an artificial intelligence feature that's been around for a long time in Excel. So let's say I have the supervisor name and all I want to do is pull out the last name. So I'm going to create a working column, one that I might use or move someplace else. But in this case, I want a place to be able to capture that. It works best if you are next to the data, although Excel's smart enough to find it even if you're not. But I think you'll find it easier to just feel like, you can kind of double check your work this way. So basically, it's looking for a pattern. So that does assume that the data has some consistency. And you might need to clean the data up, or you may have to kind of teach it as it goes along in terms of working with it. So I'm putting in the pattern here for the last name. Notice what happens when I type in the next last name. Excel just goes, hey, is this what you want? And this might be hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of entries. And now you're going to tell everyone, gosh, that took me hours. But really it didn't. It just took moments. If you want this, just hit enter. If you don't, then keep typing. And now it's populated. Now, if for any reason there was something that as you went along, it didn't pick up correctly, you can type it in and Excel typically will make note of that and fix it for you. So that's pretty brilliant for you to be able to get that so quickly. And it's not a function. If we look at this cell, it's just showing what it extracted from it, which is pretty neat. Here's another example. What if I want something in the middle? So where we saw before that mid, well, I can just tell it here, I'd like to have that code that's right in the middle there. And as I start typing, it puts it in for me. Now, let's just say, for instance, for some reason it did not. It just, it didn't pick up on that pattern. This is where we can use the shortcut key or kind of force it to do a fill series. So let's try Control E, and that usually will do the trick, Control E. So that is another way for us to sometimes be able to take advantage of things that are built in, so we don't even need functions. So the functions definitely have their place and they can be huge time savers for you, but wanted you to know and be familiar with your flash fill as well. All right, so that's our look today as we wrap up and we look at our Excel functions. Definitely check out our other webinar from last month, part 1. And also, we hope you will join us for our future webinars. That is, they are on the second Tuesday of every month, and we already have a 2024 webinar schedule plan. And we have Microsoft Forms coming up, Microsoft Word options for working with long documents, Excel charts and graphics, and a whole lot more. So thank you so much for joining us. These are opportunities for you to be able to learn. And K-Score Technologies, thank you very much for joining us, not only this month, but hope to see you in the future. And we also, want to make sure that you can productively use other Microsoft tools. So let us know, how can we help you to be more productive? And please reach out to us for any IT services you have and consulting to support you with your Microsoft technologies. Thanks so much for joining us today.